3, 2, 1, 0.
It's here, barely 60 days after the Battle of Gettysburg. Only say in the American Civil War, there was no battle that was fought here that anybody could have predicted. Hello, and here I am at Aladuro State Park.
Yeah, look out north!
Really, on his own volition. This 900 feet of river space right here is actually an international beginning of the American Civil War. I'm in Savannah, Georgia for the night. All right, now that we're all ready and geared up, let's head on over to Flanders. Trying to repair a ship. His body is brought here. What's up, everybody? Welcome to History Things with Pat. I'm your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today, all the way from Vicksburg, Mississippi, is one of my very, very good friends, Miss Shannon Rowe. We go way back. We've been, burning black powder at Manassas National Battlefield, where she cut her teeth as a seasonal ranger, and she's catching up with us today from out in Vicksburg. Shannon, welcome to History Things with Pat. How you doing?
Hey, doing all right. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for spending, your Friday evening with us, getting some Civil War nerd time on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So it's been a little bit of time since you left the DC area and, our stomping grounds mutually at First Manassas. We missed you terribly out there.
Right.
Since you left Manassas, you didn't go straight to Vicksburg. You've had a kind of a cool journey through the historical field. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and sort of where you've been since you were at Manassas?
Sure, absolutely. So I started as an intern at Manassas in 2017, and I was interning there through West Virginia University, where I was attending grad school for a master's degree in public history. And I was so happy to return there and really become a seasonal ranger for the first time in 2018, and got to do some cool black powder stuff with you and some of the other guys, and I really enjoyed my time at Manassas. It was great. I loved the tours that I gave there. I love the story of First Manassas and even Second Manassas as well, which is often overlooked. But since being at Manassas, the next summer I ended up going to Abraham Lincoln birthplace in Hodgenville, Kentucky. So I spent 6 months out there last summer, 2019, and got to talk about Abe Lincoln, but really the unknown part of Abe Lincoln, which is him as a little boy, which most people don't think about.
A civilian version of Abraham Lincoln, before his political leadership, and also a story away from the battlefield, like you were used to telling him in Manassas. What's that experience like?
Yeah, it was really different because, as a Civil War historian, I knew the Civil War version of Abraham Lincoln, but I really didn't know about his roots and where he came from. So it was really a cool learning experience and a new challenge for me because almost everything I'd done had been tied to the Civil War. So for the first time, I was doing stuff that wasn't tied to the Civil War specifically. So I got to talk about more of the vulnerable side of Abraham Lincoln. He grew up pretty poor, and he had, his mother died when he was only 9 years old. His dad and him had a troubled relationship. So that made his childhood a little bit difficult, but his stepmother stepped up to the plate and really helped educate him and sort of grow his passion for learning, which of course rubbed the wrong way with his dad, who wanted him to be a farmer. But Abraham Lincoln had bigger dreams, and that's when they ended up moving to Indiana and then ultimately to Illinois. So, we kind of got to talk about the Kentucky backwoodsman, Abraham Lincoln, which was a really neat experience.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research on that when I knew you first went out there. I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool story, because I remember when you went out there, you texted me a photo. I guess they have the cabin preserved, inside of another structure, and I was like, oh, this is neat.
Right.
I know nothing about this, so I did some reading. Yeah. I came across a really kind of sad story about Lincoln's dad, I guess, being witness to what would be Lincoln's grandfather's death at the hands of the Native American tribe's escaping me, but if I recall correctly, I think it's Lincoln's father that is sent to beat feet and run for help.
Yeah. He's a little boy, and he almost gets killed, but it's his older brother that ends up getting killed. And it was crazy. Or his father, excuse me, it was his father. So his grandfather, yeah, that ended up dying, Abraham, which ended up being Abraham's namesake, right? So, yes, very interesting, very tragic story. And apparently Abraham Lincoln's father told that story a lot when Abe was growing up.
Yeah, so it makes you wonder how it kind of shaped him into the man that he grew to be, and I think
Right.
that's really awesome. So for all of our viewers and listeners out there, this is a really cool story that I encourage you guys to dive into some other time here. We got you, Miss Rowe, here to talk tonight about two different topics. So as you're watching this is going to get separated into two videos because we're going to talk about the Battle of First Bull Run, First Manassas, and we're also going to talk about the Siege of Vicksburg, the overall campaign surrounding it, because you know me, out here in the East, I love East and Western theater, and we don't get a ton of that out here because where I'm broadcasting to you from here in my War Department in Frederick, Maryland, I'm about 30-40 minutes south of Gettysburg, which, out here, if you say things like the Berg, that's what comes to mind. But in my mind, my heart's at Gettysburg. I'm 30 minutes from Antietam. I'm 25 minutes from Harper's Ferry. And I am literally 10 minutes down the road from Manassas National Battlefield. So, I don't get any stories that don't involve Robert E. Lee, McClellan, Meade, things like that. So I really like this story because it's going to, feature some of the most famous names of the Civil War, Grant and Sherman and things like that. Johnston.
Right.
And Johnston, I guess you get out here in the East early. But by 62, he's wounded, and later he goes out west. So we're going to get some of the names but don't really know a lot about their fight. So for video number 1, we are going to talk about the Battle of First Bull Run, July 21st, 1861, the big, I guess, opening slugfest, which should have been the entire war if you had asked both sides heading to it. Shannon,
True.
Set the scene for our viewers how we go from April 14th, I guess, when Fort Sumter has been fired upon. Lincoln has called for the volunteers, 75,000 of them. How do we get from this moment to July 21st, when we have the big open fight just outside of Manassas Junction in Prince William County, Virginia?
Right. All right. So you've got, the first shots that happened in Fort Sumter on April 12th. And then you've got Lincoln. Oh, you're good. Then you got Abraham Lincoln, right, calling up those 75,000 troops. And that's really what ignites the South, was all of a sudden the government is going to invade the South. And, whether their cause was for slavery, whether it was for self-defense, a mix of both, certainly, you've got 75,000 men that are about to knock on your door. But where are they going is the key. And most Southerners realize this. They're going to the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, which isn't that far away from the Union capital in Washington, D.C. So almost everybody realizes at the outset that the war is going to be fought between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. Now, if there's a 75,000 man army headed there, how are they going to get to Richmond? Well, they're not necessarily going to walk there, as it turns out.
Oh, right.
They're going to take a train, which was their primary mode of transportation. Well, there's 2 railroads that are very important in getting from D.C. to Richmond, and the two make a junction at a small place called Manassas Junction. And so the Confederacy realizes that this is a very strategic point, this railroad junction, and they know that it's important for them to control that railroad junction. So as all of these states are forming all of these regiments, most of them are going to be sent to Manassas Junction to get formed up, to get trained up. So even months, weeks before July 21st, before the battle actually begins, there are going to be men stationed in Manassas Junction, and they're going to be building breastworks and entrenchments and fortifications, mostly under PGT Beauregard, who is given the charge because of his heroics at Fort Sumter. So he's going to be the general in charge, and it's going to be up to him to defend Manassas Junction. And so conversely, on the other side in Washington, D.C., you've got all of these Union troops that are forming in northern states, and they're going to be sent to rally in Washington, D.C. And it's pretty clear to Abraham Lincoln and others, Irvin McDowell, who's going to be the guy in charge of the Union Army, Irwin McDowell's going to think, look, we got to hit Manassas Junction. That's where they are. That's the first step in getting to Richmond. So it becomes clear pretty early that Manassas Junction is going to be the place that it's going to hit. But what they don't realize is that it's going to be taking place a few miles north of the junction itself along the banks of Bull Run Creek.
Nice. So we have these armies sort of positioning each other. Now, the climate, the attitude leading into this fight is that this is kind of going to be the war. Once the big battle here kicks off, it's going to decide the fate of the tensions that have been building. Now, we had the secession crisis kicked off with Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. You had 7 states led by South Carolina that are going to initially secede. There's going to be another 4 states that follow in a second wave, amongst them most notably Virginia. You mentioned the Confederate capital in Richmond. I think it's important for the listeners to know that the Confederate capital being in Richmond was not always the case. Initially, it's in Montgomery, Alabama, and it gets moved up to Richmond as sort of a way to draw Virginia more into the fold of the Confederacy.
Right.
So everybody's kind of thinking that this fight's going to decide the day. And like what I mean that is like the South is seceding to form their own Southern independent Confederacy, and the North, the Union, the United States of America is trying to hold on to them to preserve what is the American experiment that was handed down from the Founding Fathers.
Right.
What do you think, realistically, do you think the leadership on both sides was thinking this would be all over and done in one, or do you think that was more of a civilian mindset based on how historical wars had been fought in the past?
Sure. I would honestly say that some did and some didn't. I think a lot of these commanders, many of them are young, especially at Manassas. Sure, they've seen experience in the Mexican-American War, many of them. Some had not. I always will point to William Tecumseh Sherman himself, who he believed from the outset that this was going to be a long and bloody war. And this, it's interesting to point out, he did not fight in the Mexican-American War. So he hadn't really seen that kind of a conflict before, and yet he still predicted that this would be a very bloody conflict. Other generals, I'm not sure specifically about their individual thoughts and feelings about this, but I don't think any of them could have predicted that this was going to be a 4-year war. You know, maybe they thought, okay, it's going to be more than 3 months, like most of the men's enlistment times would be, but they probably didn't think that it was going to be a 4-year war, and probably Sherman didn't know that either as well. But the men themselves, they're excited. They're so excited, and they're ambitious. They're out there for adventure. All of them on both sides believe in their cause, and they genuinely believe that, you know, the other side can't fight. You know, the Confederate troops are like, oh, they're a bunch of city boys. You know, they don't know how to ride. They don't know how to shoot. They're just a bunch of city boys. We're going to take care of them in one day. As soon as they see us, they're going to run for the other direction. But the Union boys are like, oh my gosh, those guys are so uneducated. They have nothing between their ears. There's no way that they're going to stand up against this blue army, this blue wave. They're going to go away. So both sides underestimate the other. Absolutely.
That's where you get the, I guess it sort of plays into that, I guess, conversation that, I guess it's McDowell that he's having a conversation with Lincoln about green, you know, who's green on the field. And he's like, yes, you're green, but they are also green kind of thing. It's like, everybody is inexperienced and underestimating their opponent opposite the police space. So
very overconfident.
So the armies don't just sort of get ready and then agree and meet and fight. Now the Confederate forces, as you said, had been sort of staging in the area, recognizing the importance strategically of the junction on the way to Richmond, Virginia, the capital. And we are in an era where capturing capital cities not only is symbolic, but it's kind of like the accepted, okay, you know, checkmate of situations. The Union is dealing with a different situation. Yes, they're bringing men into Washington City, and yes, they're drilling and training. But there does come a point in time where they have drilled and trained for so long that initial enlistments are about to come up. How does that affect movements of the armies towards July 21st, 1861?
Yeah, you're right. You're doing that math absolutely right. So we mentioned that Fort Sumter happens on April 12th, right? So many of these regiments on both sides are going to be forming towards the end of April, right? So as their response to Fort Sumter. Well, then they're going to form up and they're going to start training really early May. So you've got May, you've got June, and then that third month enlistment is coming up, and that's July. And really the guys in Washington are like, you've trained as much. And that's really where that quote between Irvin McDowell and Lincoln come in, is McDowell's like, Lincoln, you want me to move, but like these guys are still really green. And that's when Lincoln points out, well, you're green, but they're green also.
Yeah.
Get moving, you know?
Yeah.
So that's when McDowell's going to realize, well, I'm going to lose the army if I don't move. So is it better to fight with the green army or no army at all? So that's when he'll start heading in that direction. Absolutely.
Now, in terms of the manpower on the field, what are the numbers we're looking at? Now, both of these armies are bigger than both of these armies are bigger than any command held in American history at this point. What are the numbers we're talking about on the opposite sides of the field here?
Yeah, so I don't remember specifically, but I do believe that Beauregard has about 22,000 men with him in Manassas Junction. So he's got a pretty sizable force. And then I believe for the Union Army, you've got about 30,000 men that are heading in that direction. Now, you notice that there's like a little bit of a discrepancy. You think, oh, the Union Army has a lot more men. But what ends up happening is Joseph Johnston and his army in the Shenandoah Valley, they were over at Harper's Ferry, and they're going to get rushed to the battlefield. And this is really the first time that troops use trains to arrive to a battlefield, which is a big moment in modern war history. They're going to arrive and they're going to bolster the Confederate numbers and essentially bring both armies to about even.
There's a really cool place out in Delaplane, Virginia, modern day. I think it's Delaplane. But I think it's absolutely Delaplane. But I think that's the port or the train station where Jackson marched to out of the valley. Put them on those trains, rode them to Harper's Ferry, put them on new trains, you got them out to Manassas Junction.
Yep, I believe correct.
Which is an incredible logistic feat. I think they cover 150 miles in like a matter of just a couple days. You know.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, pretty.
The other thing that people don't really realize when Shannon and I say numbers like this, 35,000, 22,000, that's not every single person fighting. Like, for instance, on the field, the numbers engaged are pretty even. They both hover right around 20,000. Like, there's a few thousand of Beauregard's guys that are not involved, some of Johnston's guys that aren't involved. Irvin McDowell's supported by a guy named Patterson. Most of his guys are not involved. So there's a lot of people who are there and not fighting, and so that's why the math, like you just said, Shannon, makes sense initially. Oh, the Union has a superior numeric advantage. Well, not everybody involved in that number is going to be involved in the fight, and so the fight on the field is pretty friggin' easy.
It is.
So take us into the couple days before we actually get to the fight. When is Jackson first mobilized by Johnston out of the valley? Like, when is that whole big, gods and generals, Sandy Pendleton, we got to get on trains and get to Manassas Junction and all that happen?
Right. Sure. So in a few days leading up to the fight, you mentioned Robert Patterson. He's the other Union general that's got a whole other wing of Union troops. And their job is essentially to go take Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Now, opposing them is Joe Johnston's Confederate Army, and essentially they kind of maneuver, playing a big chess match, but no major fighting happens. Ultimately, Johnston realizes that Patterson is not aggressive at all. And so that really opens the door for Johnston to go over and help Beauregard. And once Beauregard gets word that the Union Army has left Washington, D.C., thanks to Confederate female spies, Beauregard is going to message Johnston to say the Union Army is on its way. And I need all the numbers possible. Because another thing that was symptomatic of being a general in the Civil War is that you always overestimated the enemy's numbers. And so that certainly, right. And so that's certainly something that Beauregard does at first. And so he thinks he needs all the men that he can possibly get. And so that's when he sends for Johnston. So as Johnston is on their way over, Beauregard is trying to figure out how is the Union Army going to get to Manassas Junction. And basically what's standing between Manassas Junction and the Union Army is Bull Run Creek. Now, a lot of the viewers might be like, okay, it's a creek, big deal. But if you haven't seen Bull Run Creek, you would know that the sides are very, very steep. So it's not like you can bring a wagon in at any given point of Bull Run Creek and just make it across, no problem. You have to cross at bridges or fords in order to get across Bull Run Creek. So Beauregard looks at a map, and he makes note of 7 different crossings that the Union Army could take in order to get to Manassas Junction. And at every single one of those crossings, he is going to put his men, an entire brigade, to guard that crossing. And then he's hoping that they're spaced out close enough together that when any one of those crossings is threatened, he can then move his troops to reinforce those that are threatened. And so they're kind of preparing their defenses and getting ready to meet the Union Army. So they're kind of playing defensively while the Union Army is on their way and playing more of the offense.
So is the Union Army sort of, descending on the area, I guess you could say, making their approach? Irvin McDowell on the other side of the line is getting some really conflicting intelligence. He's going to implement a new sort of technology and reconnaissance method to sort of get his situation straight. Can you tell us a little bit about Thaddeus Lowe and his time on the battlefield at Manassas?
Oh, interesting. I actually don't know too much about Thaddeus Lowe. The reason why is because I have become a victim of it myself, is everybody at First Manassas is focused on E.P. Alexander and his Signal Corps on the Confederate side, but they forget about Thaddeus Lowe. So I don't know much about Thaddeus Lowe, but you can tell me more about it.
Well, what do we know about Thaddeus Lowe? He's the balloon guy. He's the very famous Union balloon reconnoiter. I'll be very honest. I don't know a lot about him either. I just know that he's the guy that basically gets up in the balloon and basically sends these messages to McDowell about where everybody's forming. Because despite how this battle ends, the Union has a very strong beginning. And there is a point, we'll get to it later, where it looks like it is over in favor of the Union. So, once McDowell gets good information, good intelligence, it presumably bodes well for the Union. So I just thought it was interesting. Right as you were setting up this, talking about the Confederate defenses, simultaneously right now, this is where they're starting to see this balloon on the horizon in the distance. And a lot of them are probably going, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Very neat.
So Thaddeus Lowe, and then Union cavalry, and then actually a skirmish on July 18th at Blackburn's Ford. That skirmish, Union cavalry, Thaddeus Lowe, all of those guys, all those entities are going to give McDowell information. And that information is that the Confederates are guarding all of these bridges and fords. And so he's going to come up with a plan to basically outflank the Confederate line along Bull Run Creek. So outflank the Confederate left, and the Union Army will move around to the right. And they identify a couple of fords that they're going to use in order to get across.
So you're talking about the movements of Hunter and Heintzelman's divisions swinging out towards Sudley Springs.
That's right.
Excellent.
Yes.
Very
yeah.
So roughly when that's happening, that's probably getting pretty late in the morning in terms of Civil War terms. When we're making this move, it's probably around 9:30 in the morning, roughly.
Yep, that's about.
So before we get into it, let's backtrack. Let's kick this battle off. Shannon, we have very famous stories from Wilmer McLean and, breakfasts and parlors in 1865 and things like that. So let's get us going. How does the action at the Battle of First Manassas, First Bull Run, kick off?
Sure. All right. So yes, you got Blackburn's Ford that happens on July 18th, and near Blackburn's Ford is Yorkshire, the plantation that belongs to Wilmer McLean. And Wilmer McLean's house is being used as Beauregard's headquarters, because if you look at a map, you'll see that Blackburn's Ford is pretty much the center of the Union line. And so Beauregard is going to be there. He does not expect the attack that happens on Blackburn's Ford, but because of the steep banks of the ford, essentially the Confederates, which happen to be under James Longstreet, and the Union side, they're going to keep to their sides of Bull Run Creek and shoot at each other. But what kicks off the skirmish at Blackburn's Ford is going to be some Confederate artillery. And one of the very first rounds goes sailing over Bull Run Creek, and it crashes into the chimney of Wilmer McLean's kitchen. And in that fireplace down below is going to be a nice turkey supper that's been cooking for Beauregard. And the bricks fall down the chimney and ruin his turkey supper. So yes, the first shots really do actually are fired in his kitchen. So when they say the war started in his kitchen, they're not wrong.
Yeah, that's a hell of a way to have your breakfast interrupted. I have this image of him just very casually and coolly, like, putting his napkin and then putting it down and be like, well, to the business, I guess, you know?
Yes, right, absolutely.
Breakfast is over.
Yes, very true. Oh, my goodness.
All right, so we've got shots through the kitchen now. The fight is on. So let's go ahead. Let's take the reins off, Shannon. Go ahead and take the long run here. Let's walk us through the battle here.
Okay.
Let's do a very famous Shannon Rowe, Henry Hill tour kind of thing. You know, one of those really awesome, because like we said, you used to love giving tours, and I've been on a bunch of those.
Yeah.
They were amazing.
Thank you.
Let's give our listeners a virtual version of that right now.
Sure. All right. So the Union Army is marching on their way towards Bull Run Creek. But again, like I mentioned before, they're going to head off towards the right and try to flank the Confederate left flank by crossing at Sudley Ford. So McDowell's going to send the majority of his army off to the right to cross at Sudley Ford. But he wants to fake the Confederates out. So he comes up with sort of a feint movement, and he is going to send some men to oppose the last Confederates in that line. And those men are commanded by Nathan Shanks Evans. And Evans is going to be stationed at the Stone Bridge. And he's going to be there, and early in the morning, he's awoken, and it's reported that there are Union troops headed in his direction. And so, you know, sun comes up, it's about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and he's going to see the Union troops on the other side. And he's like, oh my goodness, they're going to try to cross at the Stone Bridge. And the Union troops on the other side, they know that they're just feinting. This is just a feint movement. So they're just going to be a presence there. Now, there's a few pot shots taken by both sides. They're both going to be taunting each other and, you know, trying to intimidate the other side. And so Evans, for the time being, his whole focus is the Stone Bridge, the troops on the other side of the Stone Bridge. So he sends messages to Beauregard that says, the Union Army is in my front. Well, as he's focusing here, he's going to get a message from who I mentioned before, E.P. Alexander, who is in charge of the Confederate Signal Corps. Now, he's got a station on the hill behind Stone Bridge. And that station is going to get a message from E.P. Alexander that says, look to your left, you are turned. And in that message alone, he realizes, oh man, so this is just a feint attack. The entire Union Army is going to cross at the ford to my left, where there are no Confederate troops, the Sudley Ford. So he makes, to me, in my opinion, one of the most important decisions, if not the most important decision of the Battle of First Manassas. And it's going to be a gamble, quite the risk. But what he decides to do is split his small brigade, which has a total of 2 regiments in it. You've got the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion, the Tigers, and you've got the 4th, that's right, the 4th South Carolina is the other regiment. And so he's got just a few men. So what he decides to do is he decides to keep 2 companies of the 4th South Carolina in front of the bridge. But the entire rest of his brigade, he is going to move back along the road, and he's going to try to meet those Union troops after they cross the Sudley Ford.
So he leaves like 200 guys to guard the bridge?
Yeah, about 200, 300 guys alone to guard the bridge. Now, he has no guarantee that they aren't going to try to cross at the Stone Bridge. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know that the Union Army thinks that the Confederates have mined the bridge to explode if they attempt to cross it. He doesn't know that. So this is a big risk for him to leave only 300 men at the stone bridge and take the balance of his brigade essentially to the next high ground to his rear, which is going to be Matthews Hill, which sat astride the Sudley Road, which obviously led to the Sudley Ford. So he's going to take his Tigers and the rest of the 4th South Carolina, and he is going to bring them back towards the Matthews House and Matthews Hill, and he is going to place those guys not on the high ground, which is a very interesting decision. And maybe he made a good decision in moving his men, but ultimately a bad decision in placing his men on Matthews Hill, because he's going to have them in the low ground. So, meanwhile, the Union Army is crossing at the Sudley Ford, and they are going to take the Sudley Road down, because the Sudley Road ultimately leads to Manassas Junction. So they're crossing, and in the lead of the Union line is going to be Ambrose Burnside's brigade. And in the front of his brigade is going to be the 2nd Rhode Island. And the 2nd Rhode Island is going to come down the Sudley Ford, and they're going to get surprised by a volley sent by Evans' men. And so this is really when the fight is beginning to get general, because it's going to not take too much time for Burnside to deploy his whole brigade. And it's going to be 4 regiments on the Union side against the regiment and a half, essentially, of Evans' Confederate troops. So there's going to be some fighting back and forth, but Evans had to think, there's no way that with my regiment and a half that I am going to stop the entire Union Army from crossing this road. His goal at this moment in time is to buy time, because he knows if he buys time, and he's going to buy time in blood, that the Confederate Army to the south of him will have time to then come to his aid. So he's sending urgent messages to Beauregard and others saying, I've been engaged, please send help, the battle is here up at Matthews Hill. But it's about 7 miles worth that the Confederate line covers. It's not going to take them just a few minutes to come to his aid. So for the time being, Evans is alone. Now, the next regiment, or the next brigade that's closest to him is going to be under Bernard B. And his Confederates are going to arrive on Henry Hill. And at a moment when Evans is hard pressed, the Louisiana Tigers charged. They got bloodily repulsed. Roberdeau Wheat is thought to be mortally wounded. The 4th South Carolina, they're getting roughed up pretty bad. Evans realizes that he's about to be outflanked and absolutely destroyed. But he looks up behind him, and he sees Bernard B. And he goes running back on his horse back up to Henry Hill to his rear and asks B to come and help his men. And B's like, are you crazy? Henry Hill is the high ground. You're fighting in the low ground, and you think that I'm going to come and help you in the low ground. Why don't you bring your men up to Henry Hill and defend this high ground? But Evans is like, look at my men. They're being cut to pieces. We need your help. And so B ultimately will relent, and he will take his regiments down the hill, across the Stonehouse Yard, and up to help reinforce Evans' line in the low ground on Matthews Hill. Now, B probably knew what the situation was, which is the Union had the advantage in everything. They had the advantage of numbers, position, and artillery. And those are 3 disadvantages that you do not want to have or be up against. And B will ultimately learn this quickly as his 4th Alabama gets cut to pieces in the cornfields on Matthews Hill. Now, Francis Bartow is also going to arrive with his 2-regiment brigade, the 7th and 8th Georgia. They'll be fed into the fight as well. But even though the Confederates seem to have numbers, the entire Union Army is coming down the Sudley Road, and they're going to deploy quickly. So it's not just Burnside's brigade anymore. It's Averill's brigade, Porter's brigade. All of these men are being filtered in. That's right, onto Matthews Hill. And so the Confederates are outnumbered, and they're going to be cut to pieces. And ultimately, Evans and Bee and Bartow realize that they need to retreat.
So in this action, my favorite Civil War commander has a very successful surprise attack coming out of Tyler's brigade. Can you tell our people about a Western theater guy who shows up for a cup of coffee out here in the East?
Oh, you're talking about Sherman's guys?
Willie T. Sherman, my buddy.
Of course, yeah. So, yeah, Sherman's guys, they're going to be a little late to the party because they were tasked partly in that feint movement in front of Evans earlier in that morning. So they're not going to cross Bull Run until a little bit later. And then he's going to be ultimately the last Union brigade to fight on Henry Hill. But yes, Willie T. Sherman is going to show up and have an interesting day at Bull Run, and one that he won't ever forget.
Yeah, so that attack, that's just like one of the straws that breaks the proverbial camel's back over there on Matthews Hill, because like you said, right, they're tasked in part of that feint, but then they peel back, they cross at a ford that's completely unguarded, so they get no resistance getting across, and then they are able to sort of come in and strike on the flank aggressively when the entire flank has already been kind of inundated. And
that's right.
So you combine Sherman's surprise attack with Burnside's pressure and Major George Sykes' pressure, and like literally right before noon, the Confederate line, like we just said, collapses on itself. It just starts to stream towards Henry Hill, the high ground that Bernard Bee kind of wanted everybody on to begin with.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks to Sherman showing up on the Confederate right flank, really towards the 8th Georgia. The 8th Georgia is going to be like, whoa, where'd these guys come from? We got to hightail it out of here. And they're going to bail really, really fast. Absolutely.
So it's about noon then, and all this action is starting to shift over, towards the climactic part of the battlefield.
Right.
As we said, things start to look like they're going really well for the Union effort, because at this point, the Union Army is deploying, but not all of it's engaged in the fight, and it looks like the Rebel Army's already on the run.
That's right. Yeah, in fact, McDowell thinks he's won. He goes riding up and down his lines that have been engaged in the Matthews Hill fight, shouting, "Victory, victory, the day is ours." And they're all cheering. Their kepis are off, and they're waving them in the air. They think they've won. But the question that I always ask my visitors is, what does victory look like? What does defeat look like? Do you think any of these guys know, especially the private individual soldier? Have they ever been in a fight before? How would they know really that they won? And they think they know because they see the Confederates on the run and hightailing it out of there. But what they can't see happening is what's beyond Henry Hill. And that's all of these Confederate reinforcements on their way, having heard Evans's cry for help, on their way, and that the fight really isn't over at all. Because what they can't see are the 5 regiments belonging to Thomas Jonathan Jackson's Virginia Brigade arriving on Henry Hill, and they're going to come up and be like, "You guys started the party without us? Are you kidding me? Yeah. This day ain't over. Come on," But the thing that happens is that Evans was successful in his attempt to buy the Confederacy time, bought time and blood. The 4th Alabama was absolutely slaughtered, lost every single field officer on Matthews Hill. So it came at a great cost, but he did succeed in buying them time. Now, McDowell's over there, the story goes, is that he thinks he's won. He's going to have himself a victory meal. And that victory meal consists of a watermelon. It's a hot day. It's July 21st, right? It's really, really hot. And he's going to start eating this watermelon, but he eats it so fast it makes him sick. And so he's going to be back and forth from the sinks for the afternoon. And essentially there is a 2-hour lull where McDowell doesn't move. His men are just loitering around on Matthews Hill with nothing to do at all. And the Confederates take all of that time to come up with a new defensive line on Henry Hill, and that's engineered by Thomas Jonathan Jackson. So Jackson's going to be up there, and he is going to place his 5 Virginia regiments along a tree line, essentially the back slope of Henry Hill. And he does that because it gives his men and his artillery 400 yards of wide open land to use as firing fields. And that's going to be very, very important. So about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, McDowell's going to finally be over his little watermelon escapade. And he's going to look over it with his field glasses and see, oh, there's some Confederates still hanging around on that field.
There's infantry forming over there.
Right. And do you think that Abraham Lincoln is going to accept anything less than absolute victory?
No.
No. He's got to be sure. But here's where he makes a critical mistake. Instead of sending his infantry to then go and meet the Confederates remaining on Henry Hill, he's going to send artillery first. And artillery that's unsupported by infantry, which, if you're a Civil War buff, you know that is a really bad life choice.
No. Don't do that ever.
No, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. So he's going to send James B. Ricketts artillery, 6 guns, as well as Charles Griffin's guns. He's going to have 5 guns. So 11 guns are going to go rumbling down the Sudley Road and up and across the yard belonging to Miss Judith Henry. And so Ricketts' guns are going to deploy on the right-hand side of the Henry house, whereas Griffin's guns are going to deploy on the left-hand side of the Henry house. Well, when they pull up and park, Ricketts and Griffin realize, what in the heck has McDowell just ordered us to do? We are only 350 yards from the Confederate lines. And not only do they have infantry here and are not retreating, but Jackson's got 13 cannons pointed directly at Griffin and Ricketts. Now, the other thing that I tell my visitors is that, listen, Union artillery, they're rifled pieces, so they can fire artillery shells over a mile, if not 2 miles. And they're sitting there within 350 yards.
I was going to say, if you don't make this point, I'm going to be upset, because you and I have seen from all of our living history programs, what do we say? This is a point-blank gunfight as far as artillery goes.
It is absolutely point-blank.
Oh.
It's going to get ugly really, really fast. Yeah. Now, so Ricketts pulls up his guns, parked. Now, before he really starts firing generally, he's going to hear these bullets thwacking into the sides of his guns, into the wheels, and hitting off the bronze and the iron. And he's going to be like, where in the world is this small arms fire coming from? And he's looking all around trying to figure out where it's coming from. And he spots some puffs of smoke coming from the Henry house. Now, is he just going to let those Confederate sharpshooters snipe at his cannoneers and his horses?
Hey.
No way.
Hey.
He's got 6 huge guns, right? So he's going to take those 2 left pieces, turn them around, point them at the house, and fire. But what he could not have known is that inside the Henry house are civilians. And so I like to tell the story this way. Imagine if you are the son or daughter of an elderly mother. And this mother has lived at this house her entire life. And you hear the sounds of battle happening on Matthews Hill earlier in the morning, and you start to get worried, and you try to convince your mother to leave. You even go so far as to have her out on a mattress and dragging her with the 14-year-old enslaved girl, Lucy, dragging her out across the fields on her mattress. When Judith Henry, the mother, goes, take me back inside my house. This is ridiculous. And the fight's getting closer and closer and closer. So you take her back inside the house. You try to get as comfortable as you can. And then you hear the rumble of artillery roll up in your front yard. And then they're going to start firing. And you hear Confederate sharpshooters that are in your house. And they're going to be firing at the Union artillerymen. So you hear that happening inside your own house. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see these Confederates run. They're going to fire, scrambling, tripping, falling all over themselves, trying to get out of the house. And that's when the first artillery shell explodes in your midst, sending you to the floor hard. You're choking on smoke and dust. Your ears are ringing. And you get up off the floor on your hands and knees, and you finally stand. You look to the bed where your mother just was, except she's not there. She's on the floor with the mattress fallen on top of her. And so you run over really fast. You pull the mattress off of her, and you look, and you see that she's been wounded in 2 different places. Well, along with your slave girl, Lucy, you're going to take sheets and, any piece of cloth that you can find, try to bind up her wounds and stop them from bleeding. But you ultimately realize that your efforts are futile and she's going to bleed out. But the battle's not over. And that's not the only artillery shell that explodes in that house. So you've got to take cover. And so they're going to go back to hiding. Lucy's going to hide underneath the bed. And then her daughter that's there with her, Judith's daughter, she's going to hide in the fireplace, which might be a smart idea. It looks like the most sturdy place in the house, doesn't it? Except what you don't expect is that the concussion of the guns inside the chimney echoing, making it extremely loud. And she is going to suffer permanent hearing loss as a result of hiding this battle in the chimney.
I wish we had this moment occur in a time where like CAT scans were a thing.
Yes.
Having suffered a few like pretty significant concussions in my life, in addition to the hearing loss that she was sustaining, like I got to imagine that her brain, being in that sort of concussion chamber environment, was getting rocked. And I wonder what the quality of life for her was later down the road. Especially considering how you watch modern day athletes dealing with things like CTE, and all the difficulty and tragedy that's come out of that. It makes me wonder about not just for her, but also with all the guys and people and civilians, gals that experienced this during the war. But because this is the big opening fight, and obviously you and I have both been affiliated with this battlefield. That's one of the stories that's near and dear to my heart. Is just on a human level, like that's like an echo chamber in the worst of ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think about Lucy too, the poor enslaved girl, and she's wounded as well. Some reports say she was wounded in the wrist, others say in the shoulder or in the ankle or something like that, but she was wounded with a shell fragment, and nobody knows what happens to her after this battle. So that's one of the questions that I've always had is what happens to Lucy after this battle ends and she's been wounded. But I can't imagine going through something like that.
Unfortunately, as you know, as I know, as most of our peers know, and hopefully most of our viewers know, that's one of these sad and tragically constant and just regular truths of this war is that there are countless stories of enslaved individuals where we have something of a substance of their life, and then that's the record. It's gone. So I would love to know what Lucy's story is as well, especially because she's not owned by the Henry family. She's there.
Right. She's loaned out. Right.
Yeah, she's loaned out from the family that owns her at the time. So, she's not even supposed to be there, like on a daily basis kind of thing. And she ends up, in the epicenter of one of the worst moments of one of the worst days in our nation's history. So, I'd love to know what happens to Lucy too. So, the fight's still raging though, right? Like, the battle doesn't suddenly end when they realize that they just killed a 90-year-old woman. There's still a fight to be had. Jackson's committing to the field. There's infantry. There's federal artillery unsupported. So let's turn our attention back to this fight that's now gone from being over to, holy crap, it's very, very far from over.
Yes, absolutely. So Ricketts and Griffin, with their artillery, they start at this point-blank firefight with Jackson's 13 Confederate cannons, right? And it's point-blank fight. It's ugly. So Ricketts and Griffin are going to be sending messages back to McDowell saying, hey, there's an entire Confederate army here fighting for us. This battle is not over, and we need infantry support immediately. So McDowell is going to choose the best regiments in his entire army to send to support the guns. And he's going to pick the 11th New York Fire Zouaves, which is a famous unit of New York City firemen that had initially been commanded by Elmer Ellsworth, who had been killed back in Alexandria a few weeks before, the first real martyr of the Civil War. So the 11th New York Zouaves are going to be one of those first regiments called into action. They're going to call in the 1st Minnesota, And they're going to call in the Marine Battalion, as well as the U.S. regulars are going to be called up. So these 4 regiments are going to be tasked with supporting the artillery and ultimately maybe advancing on Jackson's lines. So these 4 regiments are going to form in the Sudley Road, and they're going to come up behind Ricketts' guns in the Henry House. And when they get up there, they realize, holy smokes, this is a hot fight. They're in the range of Jackson's Confederate artillery, and they're going to be dodging, diving left to right, all of these shells. And ultimately, they realize they can't be laying there in the grass anymore behind the Union guns. They have to do something. And so the 11th New York and the 1st Minnesota are going to be the first to advance. Now, most reports say that the Marine Battalion and the U.S. regulars, they kind of botched their deployment. These Marines are only 3-week-old recruits. They've only been Marines for 3 weeks. They haven't trained very long, and they make a noble effort, maybe fire a round or 2 near Griffin's guns on the left side of the Henry House, but ultimately they're going to fall back in disarray. So really the only Union regiments that are going to be making this advance are going to be the 11th New York on the left and the 1st Minnesota on the right. So they're going to move in front of Ricketts' guns, and they're going to advance on Jackson's guns. Now, when the Confederates see them coming, Jackson tells his men to stay down and don't fire until they're within 50 yards, kind of like hearkening back to the Battle of Bunker Hill in the Revolutionary War. Don't fight. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes.
I have seen Gods and Generals so much that as you're telling this story, I am listening to Stephen Lang in my brain.
Yeah.
It's stressing me out.
Yeah.
Lay down,
awesome.
lay low. You know,
Yes.
wait till they 50 paces. You know, oh,
Yes.
God.
And then we'll charge them with a bayonet, right?
Yell like Furies, bitches.
Yes. So, as these Union troops are coming closer, Jackson's going to order his men to come now in front of the Confederate artillery. You don't want to be putting the cannoneers in danger, so they're going to move in front of the Confederate artillery. And when they do get close enough, Jackson's going to tell them to fire, and all 5 of those Confederate regiments are going to stand up, and they're going to deliver a unbelievable blow, a shot, a wall of metal into the ranks of the 11th New York and the 1st Minnesota. And those guys are going to get cut to pieces. In fact, they are only on Henry Hill to fire maybe 4 or 5 rounds before they ultimately retreat in absolute disarray. Each regiment loses over 40 men killed in this attack. And it's the highest of any regiment in the battle, especially on the Union side. So they're going to retreat in absolute disarray. And all of a sudden, Ricketts' guys lose their infantry support again. And so Ricketts and Griffin are going to be on their own on this line. So Charles Griffin, right? He's got those 5 guns on the left-hand side of the Henry House. And he hates his position. He realizes that he's too close. And he thinks, if I'm going to be this close, I might as well have a better advantageous position where I am firing down the flanks of the Confederate line, enfilade fire. So what he does is he's going to split his battery, and he's going to take 2 of his guns around and behind Ricketts' battery, around where the modern visitor center is today, and he's going to place those 2 guns behind what is now the visitor center parking lot, over by the Sudley Road. So he's now on Ricketts' right flank. And what that does is it points his 2 cannons down the flanks of the Confederate line.
Yeah, so he's got inflating fire on them now.
Absolutely. So he tells his men to load up with canister because he's even closer now. He's only maybe 200 yards away from the Confederate line, so he's really, really close. So he loads the guns up. Those number 4 cannoneers are ready to let loose their lanyards, right? When all of a sudden, a Union artillery staff member comes riding up, and he says, Griffin, don't fire. You're going to fire on your own men. And Griffin is like, do you not see the Confederates not 200 yards from me? Those guys are firing on us and have been all morning. So I'm about to fire. And they're like, no, they're your own men. They're your own men. And what essentially had happened was that the regiments in front of Griffin's two guns, the 33rd Virginia and then the 49th Virginia, most of those men were either dressed in their old Union U.S. Army blue uniforms, or they were dressed in their civilian clothes. So they didn't look like soldiers. And they were mistaken as Union troops. And ultimately, Griffin won't have time to fire those guns because the 33rd and the 49th Virginia realize that this is a moment to take advantage of this confusion. So they're going to charge across the field and easily capture Griffin's two guns. Now, this is a huge turning point in the battle, a huge turning point, because what it ultimately does is shape the way the rest of the battle will be fought. And that is that the Union is going to try to capture those guns back, and then the Confederates are going to try to take them again. And it's just going to be back and forth, a fight over these Union cannons. And ultimately, once those two cannons of Griffin's are going to be taken by the Confederates, Jackson is going to send the rest of his Virginia brigade forward, and they're going to take Ricketts Battery and capture those guns as well. Now, at this point, McDowell, back behind the lines, realizes, oh man, this is not good. This is a 5-alarm fire. We've got to do something. So he's going to send all of the remaining brigades, and he's got about 4 brigades left, and he's going to send them up the Sudley Road and into the fight. Now, in later Civil War battles, you're going to see brigades fighting side by side, almost fighting as a division, right? In this battle, it's pretty much fought at the regimental level. Nobody thinks, oh, we should mass our men together and send them in at the same time to overwhelm the enemy. No. This is the first major land battle of the Civil War.
Yeah, we haven't learned.
They're going to send everybody in regiment by regiment by regiment. And so that's essentially how the rest of this fight is going to look. A Union regiment is going to come up. They will momentarily take back Ricketts and Griffin's batteries and then ultimately fall back because of overwhelming Confederate numbers. Because, yes, while McDowell's got those 4 Union brigades coming to their aid, the Confederates have a bunch of brigades still coming up from points further south to help Jackson out.
Plus, Jeb Stuart's cavalry has hit the field at this point, too, which
They
is also
do.
destroying the federal response to Jeb's presence on the line.
Absolutely surprises the Union troops that are forming in the Sudley Road, because Jeb Stuart's men come charging down the Sudley Road and really mess with the deployment of these troops. And in fact, they actually run into sort of the casualties from the 1st Minnesota and the 11th New York and really mess those guys up as well.
So before we continue, let's pause and let's talk about why there is so much chaos, especially on this part of the field. It's not just because of the proximity. So we've kind of teased this a little bit through names and just sort of like we just kind of alluded to the old Union blues. So let's just talk some quick facts. So real quick, there are more than 200 different unique uniforms on the field during the first Battle of Bull Run, First Manassas.
True. Yes.
Everybody going into this fight, as we were recruiting and forming out these state militia units turning into federal units, we weren't necessarily equipping them with federal stuff because we thought this will all be over before we need to do all that stuff. So on the field, your 1st Minnesota guys are wearing red shirts and black pants.
That is correct.
Union unit. You have a 33rd Virginia Confederate unit wearing very Union blue-looking uniforms. There is a New York regiment that's escaping me. It's not the 5th New York. Maybe it is. I don't know. But there's a Union unit wearing a very quintessential looking gray Confederate style uniform. This is hodgepodge. So it can be very confusing to look at, especially when obscured by smoke and chaos of sounds of battle. So imagine you're in the Sudley Road, you're forming to sort of go up in this last effort response, and then suddenly at first you see this wave of blue uniformed horse riders, and you're like, oh, maybe our cavalry. No, it's not your cavalry. It's Jeb Stuart's guys, and they're rolling in on you. It must have been just a logistical nightmare to figure out who you were even looking at, because this is where we get stories about the battle flags. This is sort of where the impetus to get away from the First National flag starts to come in, because without the breeze blowing, the First National looks a lot like Old Glory when it's hung limp on a flag.
Does. Red, white, and blue.
There is a lot of chaos here, not just because of the proximity, but because of what they're wearing, because of the conditions of the smoke. It's just, I think that we should paint that picture, because the battle alone is chaos. But even if these guys just hung out on the field and you tried to use binoculars to identify people, it would be a nightmare.
It would.
In a safe environment, and now we're talking about war. So, crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite stories about sort of the friendly fire incidences that happen during this, which happens so much throughout this battle, is after the capture of Griffin's guns, the 6th North Carolina is dressed in all Union blue, essentially, uniforms. They've got straight blue uniforms on, and they are fighting with remnants of the 11th New York and the 1st Minnesota, all whom are wearing red shirts. And so when the 6th North Carolina gets into the woods behind Griffin's guns, they're like, stop firing, because they see the red shirts, and they're like, oh, these guys are Confederates, so we can't fire on them. Whereas the red shirts, all those guys, Union guys, are like, wait, these guys are wearing blue. These guys are Union. So there's almost like a ceasefire that happens in the middle, and then they both realize, oh, wait a minute. No, we're both actually enemies. And then there's this point-blank fight that happens in these woods. And Colonel Fisher of the 6th North Carolina, the commander of the 6th North Carolina, is going to get hit point-blank right between the eyes, and he's going to be killed instantly, essentially because he's wearing a blue uniform. And of course, that's what Fort Fisher's namesake is, this Colonel Fisher, who dies during this fight behind Griffin's guns as a result of a friendly fire incident, essentially.
There are a lot of names. So you mentioned Fort Fisher, which is very important later in this war. Big Union amphibious assaults, shades of day, big landings.
Right.
Like that. This is a battle that not only has crazy uniforms, there are, like, in terms of who are the rock stars of the American Civil War, who are the names there are a ton of the names on the field here from both theaters. Jubal Early's on the field, Sherman's on the field, Longstreet's on the field, Mosby is on the field. Most people don't realize he's not really I think he's in a mounted infantry unit. He's not out on a partisan ranger thing. Like, he's under somebody's command, I think, as a private maybe at that time.
Yes, you're right.
Oliver Howard, who is a name in both theaters of this war, he's here. So I think it's really cool if you go through the order of battle for both, Union and Confederate here. You're going to see a ton of, like, flashcard names that are relevant in 62, 63, 64. Like, I was cracking up because as you're talking, we mentioned two names that are very relevant to where I live. So we're recording this. By the time you see this, it's going to be coming out July 21st, obviously in time for the battle anniversary. But when we're recording this, it's July 10th, 1864. So the day before recording, we observed 156th anniversary of the Battle of Monocacy Junction. Well, the main Confederate commander on the field is General Jubal Early. Well, he's a colonel here during First Manassas, First Bull Run. James Ricketts is only an artillery guy at this point in the war. Later, he shows up as the lead commander of the detachment of the 6th Corps that makes its way to support Lew Wallace. So he's in command of, like, an infantry division or an infantry corps and things like that. So I think it's really cool that, like, this is one of those battles that sort of, like, names the pieces on the chessboard for you to follow for the next 4 years.
It's true.
Through a lot of blood, unfortunately, but it is if you like to follow, because I'm all about human stories. I think this is one of the things you and I first, were kindred about, is like the individual story, the human story really means a lot to me. I know it means a lot to you. So I know we focus a lot on civilians because their story is often not told, but I think we focus on officers in the military sense, but, like, we forget that these guys have careers that grow.
Yeah.
I don't know if John Brown Gordon is on the field here forgive me, but I know for a fact he's one of the guys in the war that starts like down here and then like is essentially one of the top Confederate commanders by the end, things like
Right.
that. So this is a battle that's really, really notable for a lot of the table setting it does for 4 years. So you know, this is not going well for the Union now.
No.
And we are about to have a legend made on this battlefield. And we are going to see sort of the mood of the country change. So why don't you help us make a legend and take us through the Union retreat out of here?
Sure. All right. So during this fight, yes, all of a sudden things are looking grim for the Union, right? 2 hours ago, they'd won the war, right? And then all of a sudden, in the span of an hour, they've lost a lot of guns. They've lost at least 8 cannons on Henry Hill, and they send in units piecemeal up the hill to defend the guns, only for them to get shattered. And so things are not looking very good. Now, the Confederates, especially Jackson and others, they're going to be looking for more reinforcements onto the field. And if you recall, the casualties and sort of the remnants of the men from the Matthews Hill fight, men that belong to Evans, Bernard B., Francis Bartow, they're going to be in the woods behind Jackson, essentially, as this battle is going on. And they're going to be exhausted, right? I mentioned the 4th Alabama lost every single field officer in that fight. So they're like, look, man, we're done. You know, I saw my best friend shot in front of me. We had no leadership. I'm tired. I'm hot. I'm thirsty. We've lost the war, right? We're done. We're done. Well, Bernard B. is going to ride up to these guys, and they're going to say, this fight isn't over. We need you. We need you guys to reform and to come in on Jackson's right flank and help defend this hill. But those guys are like, no, we're done. We're out. And that's when Bernard B. supposedly rides out in front of his men, points over towards Jackson and says, "Yonder stands Jackson like a stone wall. You know, let us go to his assistance." And that will rally the men and essentially make a legend, that line, Stonewall Jackson, who stands like a stone wall up on Henry Hill and takes those Union guns and essentially wins the day on Henry Hill at the First Battle of Manassas. So yes, that legend is born of Bernard B. Now, the other half of the story should be told in the sense that it's very possible.
B is not a fan of Jackson. Just say it, girl.
Exactly. Right. That B is not a fan. In fact, it's very possible that he refers to Jackson as a stone wall because he wouldn't move to his assistance earlier that day on Matthews Hill. Right. And that he meant that term as a term of derision towards Jackson, and out of frustration, that's what he meant. Of course, the former version of that story is the one that's been remembered, that Jackson stood like a stone wall, positively speaking, at Manassas. And so that's what's been remembered. And Bernard B.'s family, his descendants to this day, affirm that that is, in fact, the truth of what happened. But we will never really know.
Yeah, we'll never know because he got shot. Now, one of the things, just because I like to do history rabbit holes that kind of just go completely left for no reason, and they sort of find a way to circle all the way back around to make perfect sense. So I live about a little less than an hour from Westminster, Maryland. And Westminster, Maryland is the home of a Revolutionary War Home Guard colonel, a very famous guy by the name of Gist, Colonel Joshua Gist, or Gist. I'm not sure how to say his last name. And his brother Mordecai is a general that serves in Washington's army. So whereas Colonel Joshua is staying local during the Revolution and sort of within the borders of Maryland in a Home Guard style unit, his brother is a general in Washington's army, and this is really cool. One of their descendants, who's got a hella interesting name, he's a colonel in the Confederate Army. His name is State Rights Gist. He's going to be he's B's aide-de-camp, and he's going to assume command of the brigade on the spot, kind of right there. And it makes really no sense other than the fact that it's a cool way to connect a bunch of random moments in history. But, like, if you really like the minutia and the order of battle and you go through, you're going to come across this guy's name and you're going to go, well, that's a really interesting name because his name is actually States' Rights. And his family is actually military, like strong military stock, because 2 of his ancestors are heavily involved in our American Revolution, as a lot of their forebearers were. But I just, in this moment with Bernard B., the guy that sort of takes over is connected to this, which is, more or less in my backyard here.
Yeah, and I love States' Rights Gist because he comes and fights in the Western Theater not too long after Bull Run, and I'm a Western Theater historian, so I love States' Rights.
Now, States' Rights, because we're not going to cover it on this show, so we don't have to worry about spoilers now. He buys it at Franklin, doesn't he? Yeah, I think the end of the war for him comes. He's either mortally wounded. Is he KIA outright on the field, or is he mortally wounded?
I don't know. I'd have to double check on that one. I know that he's one of the 6 Confederate generals that is either mortally wounded or wounded at Franklin, but I do believe he bites it.
I think he is killed at Franklin because I remember when I discovered Joshua Gist, I found his grave while I was like killing time at work one day. And so I just kind of like, rabbit holed and searched this. And so just for the record, States' Rights isn't the only interesting name in that family. I think States' Rights has a sister or an aunt named Federal Ann.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, like her name, her first name is Federal. And then, like, Jesus. So, you know what? They were a very patriotic family, I guess, once upon a time.
Yes.
It's a very interesting thing. So Bernard B. is mortally wounded. He never gets to explain, what this means. The legend of Stonewall Jackson is born. And this will carry deep into the war. Even after Jackson's death, the name Stonewall will carry weight. In 1965, when the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia is about to quit the field, there's a moment where Lee is riding among the men and somebody points out the Stonewall Brigade to him. I guess they're saluting him, and he's essentially like, we salute you guys, just because of that reputation. So while the name might have come from a place of not so love or admiration, I guess what we should do to be safe is we should stick to the company line as of now that it was a rallying cry. But however it formed from this moment later, what is the Stonewall Brigade does earn battlefield credentials because they do appear in some of the hardest fights. They do fight very well. We'll have you back on the show another day to talk about Second Manassas, but the Iron Brigade to be versus the Stonewall Brigade there is one of the heavyweight infantry fights. And so that name goes on to become something that means something on the battlefield, and it emotionally, psychologically terrifies Union soldiers at various points during this war.
It does.
So the Federal lines have started to break now, and it's obvious that this pendulum has swung ridiculously far back in the other direction against Irvin McDowell, and retreat is going to be ordered. They didn't win this battle. The day is won. The day is lost, straight up. So talk about how we come to that moment. What is the realization like for McDowell when he realizes it's time to go?
Sure. So really one of his last Hail Marys is going to be William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade. McDowell has sent unsuccessful brigades, regiment by regiment, into the fight. They've all gotten turned back. Now, Sherman's going to show up on the field, right? And he helped turn the tide at the Matthews Hill fight just a few hours before. And so in his brigade, he's got the 2nd Wisconsin, which will ultimately become part of the famed Iron Brigade. He's got the 79th New York Highlanders, a Scottish regiment. And then he's got the 69th New York, which, of course, is the famed Irishman. So those 3 regiments are going to arrive on the field under Sherman. And Sherman, although he is an excellent strategist later on in the war, isn't so much here at First Manassas because he makes the same mistake his predecessors did, which is send them in regiment by regiment. So the 2nd Wisconsin goes up first, and guess what color uniform they're wearing? Gray. So they get fired on by other Union regiments that are waiting in the Sudley Road because they think that they're Confederates. And so
knock it off, it's us, guys.
Yeah, and the 2nd Wisconsin does not last long because they're being fired at from both directions on top of Henry Hill. So they retreat in disorder. Then the 79th New York goes running up the hill, and Simon Cameron, their commander, is going to be wounded. They lose their commander, and they're going to fall back. Then the 69th New York's turn to go up there, and they get into a vicious hand-to-hand fight with Wade Hampton's South Carolina Legion. And it's going to be nasty. Fists, musket butts, bayonets. It's going to be ugly. And it's such a close fight that there is sort of a tug of war over the 69th New York's flag. And ultimately, one of the color bearers for the 69th New York will tear off the flag from the staff and shove it in his shirt to save the flag from being captured by the Confederates. So it's a pretty crazy fight, but ultimately the 69th New York is not going to do much. And at that point, the Union's pretty much used up all their reserves. Everybody's gone into the fight or at least seen it for a few moments. And so McDowell's going to realize, oh boy, this is not good. And at the same time that he's realizing this, more Confederate reinforcements that are fresh are arriving onto the field. And it's really
coming back up again. You think he's starting to get a little queasy in the tum-tum?
Yeah, probably. That watermelon's not sitting real well. Yeah, you're right.
He's like,
now. So his last gasp in this battle is going to be from a guy you mentioned earlier, Oliver Otis Howard, not yet known as Uh-Oh Howard, right? But you could argue that nickname might have started at First Manassas because he's going to be up on Chin Ridge, which is now across the road from the visitor center today. And so he's going to have 4 of his New England regiments up on Chin Ridge. And another guy that we will recognize later on is going to be Kershaw.
Yep.
Kershaw's Confederate South Carolina Brigade is going to come up, and he's going to come up alongside Early, who's got Virginians, Tennesseans, and Marylanders in his brigade. And so they're going to come up, and there's going to be a fight on Chin Ridge, but Howard doesn't last very long, and neither do his New Englanders. So they're going to really be the ones that start the rout. They get so surprised and so easily swept off the field that they're going to run for their lives back across the intersection near Sudley Road and the Stone House there in the Warrenton Turnpike, and they're going to bail. And when those guys start running, the whole Union Army is going to start running, and it's going to be a whole mass chaos stampede up the Sudley Road, back across the Sudley Ford, down the road from which they came, and back towards Washington, D.C.
I like to use the term disintegrate right here because this is really what is happening to McDowell's army. It is completely disintegrating in front of him.
Yes, that is a great word to describe what is happening. Absolutely. And who's going to be right on their heels chasing them off the field? Kershaw. He's going to chase them off the men. He's going to grab an artillery battalion, and he's going to cross at the Stone Bridge, and he's going to meet them over by Cub Run, which is another small creek a little bit further east of Bull Run Creek. And he is going to start shelling the suspension bridge over Cub Run. And that's really when it becomes a panicked stampede by the Union Army, when everybody starts yelling, screaming, running pell-mell everywhere and all over.
Well, I mean, when they're coming across the bridge, a wagon gets overturned. People are freaking out.
Yep, a shell explodes, it damages the bridge, it flips over a wagon so that nobody can get back across. So they leave cannons, supply wagons, all kinds of stuff in Cub Run trying to cross its steep banks and piled up on the other side. And ultimately it's men crawling through the creek trying to climb the banks on the other side, running for their lives. Yeah.
So it's during this action that a guy that shows up in another command situation later in the war, right near my house. Colonel Dixon Miles is tasked by McDowell with forming the rear guard. Now, this is an interesting topic, and we'll just sort of let's do this. Let's present it, and like people can make their own, judgments and things how they want. McDowell kind of tasks Miles with a nearly impossible task. Forming an effective rear guard that's going to hold long enough to rally the Army before they get to Washington and maybe turn this thing around and continue fighting. I don't think that was ever a possibility personally, so you can make the decision on your own. But when he inevitably fails to effectively do this, one of the criticisms that gets leveled against Dixon Miles is that he's drunk on the field, and he's essentially sent on a administrative duty for a while to get clean, and he is sent to what is supposed to be a relatively quiet command because remember, Dixon Miles is an older guy. He's been in the Army. He's not Winfield Scott old, but he's been in the Army before the Mexican War. Like, he's been in there a while. So they're kind of hoping that at this point they can get him clean, shoo him off somewhere, and he can just fade away into retirement. So they send him to this really quiet outpost that literally has no implications, no effects, literally doesn't matter to the Civil War in any way. They send him to this really out-of-nowhere place called Harper's Ferry. And he's in command there in 62 when Jackson shows up, and I'm going to say something that a lot of Jackson fans are going to hate because they're probably Chancellorsville guys. But Dixon Miles is in command at Harper's Ferry for Jackson's finest moment of the war. In my opinion, Jackson's encirclement, they call it a battle, but it's really a mini siege, that takes place there. That is about as bloodless of a victory as you can get in this war. It's brilliant. It's over almost before it happens. And Miles is the guy there who is, and he's actually mortally wounded there during that exchange. But here at First Manassas, another name that you're going to find later, he's tasked with this sort of impossible task of forming the rear guard, and he is sort of blamed in the political fallout for this. So do what you want with that information, but that is sort of the situation here with Dixon Miles. I always like to tell his story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good call.
All right, so now we have some very famous instances, I guess, during this retreat or accounts. Now, this battle wasn't just a battle fought between two armies and their staff officers watching.
Right.
Because this was supposed to be a one-time battle, one big show. When you said earlier McDowell thinks he won the war, that wasn't an accidental slip of verbiage there. They are thinking this is going to be the whole war. So civilians and politicians alike have made their way out to the hills surrounding Manassas Junction, between Centerville and there really a lot, to kind of watch this thing. Imagine what it must have been like for them when the Union troops were literally streaming through their picnics.
Right.
Pretty wild. Yeah. So can you talk about, there's a situation, are you familiar with a politician that's captured during this? Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. Let's go ahead and talk about this United States politician who is becomes a prisoner just by having a picnic in the wrong place during this retreat.
Right, absolutely. So yes, there are civilians that have followed the Union Army to the battlefield. They're in their Sunday best dresses. They pack their picnic baskets because it's a long ride. It's about 23 miles from Washington, D.C. So it's a pretty long ride. So they've got their meals packed, So they're there in Centerville, about 7 miles away. I will repeat, there were not civilians on the battlefield watching the battle happen before their eyes. Yeah. They're 7 miles away from the fight, and they're watching it. Essentially, if they have, field glasses, binoculars that they're looking through, they are. And they can certainly hear the battle, and they can see the smoke, but they're not going to see guys die right in front of them. Yeah,
they're seeing ants at best blow smoke at each other with a lot of thunder on a sunny day.
Yes, exactly. And I have been to the heights of Centerville. Of course, it's very much forested now. But yes, that's essentially at best what they would have seen. Now, that wasn't every civilian. So like you mentioned, there were a few, including Congressman Ely, who is going to sneak a little bit closer. They want a little bit more of a closer look. Now, Ely was a guy who was known to be quite the war hawk, in the sense of he wanted this war and he thought it was going to be over so fast and so soon. And so he's going to be caught up in the excitement and he's going to want to watch this war happen and end in one day, right? And he claims that he is going to be the first member of Congress in Richmond, okay? This happens before the battle, all right? So he gets a little bit too close to this battle, right? And what he doesn't really know is happening in real time is that the Union Army is now retreating, right? So he gets kind of caught up in this retreat, and he's going to see that he's soon surrounded by Confederates. So he tries hiding behind a tree. That doesn't work out for him. Confederate cavalry ride up on him, and they point a gun to him, and the Confederate cavalryman wants to blow his head off. Cooler heads will prevail, and that will not happen. But Congressman Ely will be captured and sent to prison in Richmond. And so he, in fact, is the first congressman in Richmond, just not as the conquering hero he thought he was going to be, but instead a prisoner.
Yeah, you weren't wrong, but it didn't go the way you thought it was going to go.
Right, exactly. Yup.
So this retreat is chaos. It is demoralizing. It sends the Union Army back like a lick dog all the way back to Washington City. The Southern press will eat this up. They're going to label this the Great Skedaddle, which will embolden support for the war, actually on both sides, because there is a sense in the South that it's like, we can do this. Like,
yes.
We hung against this big army, and we won mightily. So there's this whole like positive momentum vibe, and then there's this whole like galvanized, pissed off feeling in the North. People are like, like, we got to do that one again. Like, no way. So before we get out of the story of First Manassas and into the phase that I guess Matt, my co-host from the History Things podcast, Matt Borders, he and I call it the phony war phase, because there's just a lot of positioning and staring across the river at each other. It's kind of like the Cold War part of the American Civil War. There's not a lot of action, but it does flare up and get hot from time to time. But before we get to that point, we've had this great retreat. The Southern press is sort of writing about it. What are some of the aftermath? What is the aftermath of the battle? And then I got a few questions for you to wrap up here.
Sure, absolutely. So ultimately, this battle is going to change the way that Americans view war forever. They're going to realize very soon that we're not going to go out and be spectators to see a battle. That's a very bad idea. They also realize that sending green armies into the field to fight each other, especially in different colored uniforms with very confusing flags, is also going to be a bad idea. But they also realize that this war is going to last longer and be bloodier than they expected, because once they count the casualties and the deaths from the battle, they're going to have almost 5,000 casualties, which is way more than anyone ever expected, because most men expected, one army to show up and the other one to run away as soon as they did. So they thought that this was going to be, virtually bloodless. And all of a sudden, you've got 5,000 men dead or dying or captured on these fields surrounding Sudley Ford and the Sudley Road and Manassas Junction. And it's shock to the American public, both North and South.
For perspective, people need to realize, obviously, that, like we mentioned at the very beginning of this program, that both leaderships are in command of army strengths that are far in excess of what we've ever commanded in the field before. And just for reference, right, I think the highest speculated totals for Irvin McDowell's forces are like close to 35,000 guys.
Yeah.
I think if you, with Johnston's support to Beauregard, I think there's like 25,000 Confederates on the field. That's a lot. During the American Revolution, we had like 1,200 guys against 2,000 guys. and there were like 50, sometimes 100, maybe 200 casualties per side, and those are heavy casualties and things like that. And
Right.
so we've just talked about like tipping the scales on everything we're doing, and just for more context, continuing the timeline, as far as the Civil War, we're talking about Revolutionary War style casualties, because while 5,000 casualties is epic and amazing and shocking, earth-shattering for the people of the United States in 1861, 5,000 casualties becomes just a cup of coffee by 1865. I mean,
Right.
Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, the Siege of Petersburg, the entire Overland Campaign, just to rip off a few, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg,
Chickamauga.
Chickamauga. So you get these. I mean, Franklin is not a huge numbers thing like that, but in terms of like the casualties percentage-wise sustained, it like the Battle of Franklin is such a devastating, casualty count that it effectively ends the war in the West. Hood's career is over. Things like that. So Manassas is shocking on a relative scale only because we haven't done this yet. I like in this moment, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, this is one of the Civil War has a few deep breaths before the plunge kind of moments. This is another one of the big ones, because from here we enter the phony war phase, which I mean by that is where we're at war. This is going to continue, but there's not a lot of immediate action, and that's because both sides are taking stock of what happened and trying to figure out what comes next. So I want to ask you a few questions before we wrap up here. So we're going to have you back to talk about Vicksburg, because that's where you are now, and that is your other story near and dear to your heart. I knew that about you from the day I met you, that you loved the West, and Vicksburg was one of your favorite stories. Vicksburg and First Manassas, First Bull Run, are incredibly consequential battles for campaigns, battles, actions for the American Civil War. Why do you think they are overshadowed so much up against other battles like Gettysburg or Shiloh and things like that?
Yeah, good question. I would say for Manassas is significant because it was a first, right? It was a first, it was a shock. But like you said later, 5,000 casualties, that's just a drop in a bucket come later on in the war. And so naturally, a battle like Manassas is going to be overshadowed by Gettysburg's 52,000 casualties. Right. I also tend to think that Manassas wasn't fought like other Civil War battles were. It was kind of an outlier in terms of tactics, just because of the inexperience and the mismatched uniforms. And these are inexperienced commanders, really, as well as the men who they're leading, such as Sherman, sending in regiment by regiment by regiment instead of an entire brigade. So its tactics are very different from the rest of the Civil War. And so I think we're more comfortable talking about some of those bloodier battles with more standard Civil War warfare that we're used to studying. And I think that's part of the reason why Manassas gets so overlooked. And to a certain degree, it's why Vicksburg gets overlooked. Vicksburg was a very, very long campaign. I mean, we're talking about a 6-month-long campaign here. And it's very hard for someone to grasp the significance of Vicksburg without also grasping a 6-month campaign, which is difficult to do. Gettysburg is a little easier. It's about a month-long campaign, right? And it's a little bit easier to figure out how the armies got there, why they ended up fighting at Gettysburg, and then it's a 3-day fight, bing, bang, boom, done. Vicksburg is a lot more complex in terms of the campaign to get there, and then the 47-day siege until Vicksburg capitulates. So it's just more complex in breadth, especially.
The average, I guess, the average person that observes the Civil War in our day is a very casual observer to it. There's not a huge community. To us who are deep diving nerds, our community seems very vast. Our peers seem very many, but up against the population of our country, it's a very small community. So the average person, doesn't really want to, and I don't know if it's they want to or not, but the average person doesn't really have the focus to follow 6 months of campaigning minutia,
Right.
which involves, if depending on how you classify actions, you could be talking about hundreds of mini battles, cavalry
Right.
snaps, reconnoiters that go wrong, things like raids and all that stuff. So,
Sure.
is it fair to, I guess, equate first Bull Run, first Manassas as a sort of test drive or a rough draft to the war? Like everybody submits their idea, or like, let's take the war out for a spin and see how we fight this kind of thing? Because case, or best case, we win. Worst case, we fight another day. Because I also don't believe that either side was willing to have it be a one-day fight. Like the loser, in my opinion, was going to ultimately fight again another day.
Sure. I agree.
So is the test drive, is the rough draft analogy a fair one? That this was sort of where we tried some stuff and then made corrections and turned in a final paper over the next 3 years?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, you've got a lot of new tactics that are being used. You know, we kind of talked about how McDowell just throws out artillery unsupported by infantry. They're going to look at those notes, you know, in the next few months and be like, oh, that's a bad idea. Maybe we won't do that next time. Or, oh, we just sent in regiment by regiment. What if we sent them in as brigades and massed men together? So both sides are going to be very reflective when it comes to First Manassas, and they're going to learn a lot from what happened at Manassas, whether that's, hey guys, we need to kind of have uniforms where like we're all the same color roughly. Maybe we need to get better weapons that are more rifled. You know, maybe we just need to have better supplies. Maybe we need to be trained more. And then certain tactics are going to be reflected upon and utilized. And lots of things are going to change as a result.
When industrial warfare really is going to take off in this nation, because we're going to put the industries of our nation, Confederate, Union, North, South, however you want to term it, both parts of this fight are going to put their industry to work on mass scales to support it. And that military-industrial complex is something that our nation has got a lot of, fingers in the pie of today. The military-industrial complex that our nation runs today in the 20th and 21st centuries, it dictates other conflicts that we're not even on the battlefield of. They're using our technologies that we mass produce. So, like, this all the Civil War is innovative, not just in the ways you think, but like industries that are around us today were created sort of as a necessity to fight this war. I think that's really cool. So, all right, Shannon, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to get out of here on the story of First Manassas for today. I really appreciate you stopping by and hanging out with everyone here on History Things with Pat. Before we go, I will ask you one final question, since we did have so much time together at Manassas, and I can load and fire a musket infinitely faster than you, and I just want to say that. This is my show, Shannon, no arguing. I'm just kidding. I miss you a lot up here. You know, you're one of my favorite people I've ever met here at the battlefield. What is the thing, other than me and all the cool guys that did live in history with you, what is the thing you miss most about being on the grounds up here and, and being Shannon?
Honestly, it would have to be about giving my Henry Hill tour. I loved giving that tour. Essentially, I just loved holding my audience in the palm of my hand and painting this battle around them. Because I feel like, once you simplify it a little bit, it's really not hard for the average listener to really grasp and understand, because it's the first battle. It tends to be a little bit easier for people to observe, even non-Civil War people. And I really loved how the story of Henry Hill really integrates so many aspects of the battle, whether that's the civilians, with Judith Henry being the first civilian casualty of the Civil War, or artillery or infantry, hand-to-hand fighting. You've got sort of some interesting character stories such as Stonewall Jackson, Irvin McDowell, Sherman even. So there's a lot of different aspects that you can weave throughout the story, and people really seem to enjoy it. And I just miss giving that tour, and it's a beautiful, beautiful landscape. It really, really is. So I just miss walking those fields.
So we're going to put you on the spot then. So next time you're back out in the DC Capital region and we can make it happen, we are going to do a History Things with Pat live Facebook tour hosted by Shannon Rowe.
Yeah.
Who's going to come down here and bring her rock star skills. We'll do that so that you guys can experience the tour, because I've been on it, and I cannot pump it up enough. Like, Shannon is one of my favorite Civil War storytellers. As you guys know, I cling to my favorites. And Shannon, when she was moving off in the park, it was heartbreaking. So I've really enjoyed you stopping by History Things with Pat today to hang out and talk First Manassas. First will run with us. It is the 159th anniversary of the battle as you are watching this. So we have come quite a long way since the first big, oh my gosh, moment of this war.
Yeah.
And we have miles to go in terms of learning and interpreting the story that was the American Civil War. So Shannon, I thank you a lot for coming. We'll see you again in a few weeks with the Vicksburg story. I can't wait to get into things like siege warfare, the Mississippi, really sneaky boat movements. You guys have a hero. You guys have a more or less fully reconstructed of sorts ironclad to talk about.
Sure do.
I'm a big, it's sort of, I guess it's lame of me on my own show here. I love Navy things. I love the sea, everything from piracy to just like America and Britain and France's and Spain's like kind of naval warfare history, Germany with the First and Second World Wars and stuff like that. And we never really cover the Navy on this show. So
No.
or anything really remotely nautical. So when we come down to Vicksburg to talk, we're going to talk about the Cairo and other things. So I'm really excited about that. So for my guest today, Shannon Rowe, I'm your host, Pat McGuire. Thank you all for joining us on History Things with Pat, and we will see you all next time.
All right.